January 20, calling the January 27th, 2022 FinCom meeting to order, Finance Committee of the Town of Nantucket to order. And I will go ahead and read the script for remotely conducted open meetings. So, public participation guidelines. Members of the public wishing to participate in the meeting must use their full name for Zoom access. If full names are not used, people will not be allowed to participate in the discussion. The town reserves the right to remove any member from the public from the meeting who doesn't use a full name or acts inappropriately. As a preliminary matter, this is Denise Cronow, Chair of the town's Finance Committee. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative, starting with George Harrington.
Aye.
Peter McEachern.
Here.
Joe Grouse.
Here.
Peter Schaefer.
Here.
Chris Glowacki.
Aye.
Stephen Morey.
Here.
Thank you. Staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative in the order in which I see you. So Ken Bogrand.
Present.
Maria Basheva. Here. Vince Murphy.
Here.
Tucker Carlson.
Not here. Tucker Holland here.
Oh, so. That's how my day's been going, honestly. It's
We
pretty-
like you much better though, Tucker.
Yeah, we do. Tucker Holland. Thank you. Yeah, that just shows how much this person is out in the public space. Terry Norton.
I'm here.
Thank you. Okay. And anticipated speakers on the agenda. I've already called on Vince and Tucker and Ken, so I will just move right along to this open meeting of the Finance Committee of the Town of Nantucket is being conducted remotely pursuant to Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required by law. This meeting will feature public comment. For this meeting, it's convening by video conference via the Zoom app. This posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please note that this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees are participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you and to take care not to screen share your computer. Anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials have been available on the town's website. We are now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective and clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. I will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude, I will look to the Finance Committee members, inviting them to provide any comments, questions, or motions. Please hold until your name is called. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you're not speaking, and please remember to speak clearly and in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. Okay, and finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. So we have call to order, video announcement. May I please have an approval of the agenda?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Thank you. By roll call, George,
Aye.
Peter McEachern,
Aye.
Joe,
Aye.
Peter Schaefer,
Aye.
Chris,
Aye.
Joanna,
Aye.
Stephen. Denise, aye. Okay, thank you. I am now opening the floor to public comment. So if you have a public comment, please hold up your little digital hand. And with that, I will close public comment and look for approval of the minutes from January 10th and January 13th. Are there any changes to those minutes? Seeing no one offering any changes, may I have a motion to approve both?
Motion to approve both.
Thank you. May I
Second.
have, thank you, George. So by roll call, George,
Aye.
Peter McEachern,
Aye.
Joe,
Aye.
Peter Schaefer,
Aye.
Chris Glowacki. Chris, sorry. Chris is
He looks a
frozen.
little, he looks like he's frozen.
It looks like he's
Yes.
frozen. Okay. Joanna,
Aye.
thank you. Okay. And Denise, aye, those minutes are approved. I think Stephen's also off at this second. Okay, so now we are up to the topic of the overview of the Coastal Resiliency Plan. And Vince, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I think it's very helpful for us to get an understanding of this plan in front of the Finance Committee. As we know, there will be a significant investment over the next several years that this plan that will need to support this plan. So I appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Very, very kindly, and thank you for having me early on the agenda. I also have a lot to go through. So what I'd like to do is start sharing my presentation and just get on as quickly as I can. I know and understand I've got something like 20 minutes.
Yes, and Vince, what would you prefer? Do you want people to ask questions as you go through it, or do you want to wait to the end?
There's an awful lot, so let's how about we just wait to the end unless somebody has something really pressing. I don't mind being interrupted.
Okay, thank
Everyone
you.
can see my screen, and it's now should be in sharing mode.
Yes.
Okay. So I haven't met many of you before. I'm familiar with some of you. I'm Vince Murphy. I'm the Coastal Resilience Coordinator. I work in the Natural Resources Department. People like Joanna, who are on CRAC, may have brought up some of these issues here before. I don't want to try and confuse issues, so I'm just going to bring everything to a clean slate and try and go through this as quickly as possible. Going to go through the risks first, talk about potential solutions, go through the 40 recommendations. I've added in the costs, especially for this committee, just to give an idea, an overview of the planning numbers, just in terms of finance, and try and give it in those terms. So we first have to understand what we're talking about, and we're talking about climate change, coastal resilience and sea level rise. It's one of the climate change issues. There's a hell of a lot of source problems, greenhouse gas being one of the biggest ones, increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and causing a whole bunch of associated problems. And there's a lot on the screen here. You can talk about everything from less snow to desertification to loss of agriculture and coral bleaching. But we're really only here in Nantucket interested in these ones here on the right. Increased storm frequency activity, sea level rise, increased coastal erosion, increased coastal flooding, and risk to groundwater. These are the coastal resilience plan issues at their core. We have a lot of other things to consider, but for the CRP, these are the big ones. So I'm just going to really quickly try and give an overview of the risks. So we have had some amount of sea level rise on Nantucket. This is from the NOAA tide gauge that's on Steamboat Wharf down by the Steamship Authority. This little wiggly black line here represents the 8 inches of sea level rise we've already seen in Nantucket from about 1965 up to about 2019. The coloured lines that are in there from 2000 going out to the end of the century show the 6 different scenarios. They're in feet. The minimum we can expect most likely is 1.57 feet. Realistically, we're probably going to see 4 to 6 feet. Good to plan for 9 feet, and that is a recommendation of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee. So this is all based on this is based on different scenarios as outlined by NOAA, including the greenhouse gas emissions and how that impacts how fast ice melts and therefore how fast sea levels may rise under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And there's examples in the next few slides about the scenarios. And I like to include hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and be unsurprised by anything in between. That's about including redundancy and having some space in our planning. Here's just a quick overview of what Nantucket might look like in the 2040s. Blue areas are flooded areas, green are increased wetland areas. So this is island-wide 2040s using the NOAA high scenario. This is 2070s using the NOAA high scenario, and 2100. It gets progressively worse. In Nantucket, we've been using the high scenario as recommended by the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee and accepted by the Select Board as a recommendation. So let's just look at the downtown area and see what that might look. Still using the NOAA high scenario for 2040, just for a reference point for somewhere we all understand and know a little bit better. So the downtown area, particularly Brant Point and Easy Street, are quite badly affected. You start to move out to the 2070s, there's potentially billions in losses in property damage. This is high tide on a regular day. 2100, the water just gets deeper because we have a glacial backstop at that berm at the base of Cliffside that goes through the downtown area below Orange Street and Union Street. But we also see wetland areas increase. We also have another problem in Nantucket. We have a massive erosion problem. We already know this. We were very lucky here. We're one of the first communities in the country to get erosion mapping done. It was the first place it was released in November 2020, and since been expanded out by FEMA to other communities on the East Coast. It's going to eventually be nationwide. But we have the very earliest data. We already know that some areas in Madikit have bad erosion. We're just going to use the high sea level rise scenario because that affects how fast places erode again. So this is what might have eroded from here to 2100. Now, it must be said, these are hazard maps. These are not regulatory maps. They're advisory maps. Let's just look at Madikit to zoom in on one area where we know there's a bad issue. Everywhere in the yellow line could be gone by 2030. The orange area by 2050 and the purple by 2100. Just to put some numbers on that, that's about 2,000 feet, and that goes up to about the intersection of F Street. So you'll still be able to use the F Street boat ramp, but you mightn't be able to make that turn. But that's an advisory capacity, nothing we can use for regulations there. So this was from the draft CRP. And it's just a nice color contrast. The actual numbers went up a little bit once they finalized the CRP. So that's 2,737, but this is a nicer one for presentation purposes and still is very similar information. So we could see about 2,600 structures lost under an extreme or high scenario, and about just shy of 30 miles lost under the same type of scenario, public roads and for the most part. There's an extreme scenario where we might lose close to 10,000 properties, but that's in an extreme scenario, and we'd have to see 11 feet of sea level rise for that to happen by 2100, and we lose close to 90 feet of road. So once I've now outlined the risk, I'm going to put numerical terms to the risk. I can send this to people, it's in the CRP, but every circle has a value and a color valuation to it. The pink ones that you see mostly in the downtown area, every pink one represents $50 million. Orange ones are the next most expensive at 10 million, right down to the beige colored ones that you see mainly around Madikit and the head of Hummock Pond, that kind of area. Those are $500,000 each. There's a lot of dots on this. So this gives a good spatial distribution to where the risk is in terms of finance, and where the greatest risks are basically downtown and Madikit, and to a lesser extent to the East Shore. So we're looking at $3.4 billion in calculated damages and losses between now and 2070 potentially. That's billions, not millions. And it just gives the good visualization there. So just to look at some of the solutions quite quickly, there's some visual aids in this where there's some schematics for some designs. They're in the CRP. I'm going to kind of skip over those just to give an overview of what they might look like, and is all I'm basically going to do. So we're looking at some basic adaptation strategies. First of all, there's basically three things you can do. You can accommodate water, you can protect from water, or you can retreat from it. So the protect image here in the left is an image from Florida. In Nantucket, this would have clapper boards around it, and it would have to be approved by the HDC. But basically it shows a house on stilts. That's one accommodation method to allow water to go underneath the building. To protect, I'm using an image here from Nantucket. This is from the Dionis area, where there's, in the left-hand side of the image in the center is a wooden bulkhead, and on the right-hand side a rock revetment, and both work quite well. And then we see on the most right of the images a retreat scenario to bring your house back from the coastal edge or a flood zone. That is an image from the Toscana website. So I've just kind of explained these three, so I'll just move on. So one of the main cornerstone recommendations from the CRP and one of the main near-term strategies for the whole downtown area is what's called the Downtown Neighborhood Flood Barrier. It's a system of raised roads, reinforced dunes, bulkheads, and berms that would wind their way through the downtown system from Francis Street and Washington Street extension through the downtown area to Easton Street and onto Hulbert Avenue area. So red, for the most part, are raised roads. Then you have some berms that would be for accesses to port areas such as the Steamship Authority and going up Straight Wharf. And then there's a system of bulkheads in the middle to try and minimize the impact on the traffic system in that area. This is something that we might try and pursue sooner rather than later, but we have to understand the potential impacts of it. So this would take probably 2 to 3 rounds of scoping to understand the potential impacts and what might be acceptable to the community if this were to ever be constructed, and also understand potential routing. This might not be necessarily the correct route. So there's 3 examples here I'm going to go over very quickly. At the top, there's water's edge. Then in the center, there's an inland open space. And then at the bottom here across Washington Street is a public right of way. What they might look like is this is the water's edge one where you've got a ramp that effectively comes up to a new ADA accessible boardwalk area that would have a ramp and steps going down to the access point, say for the Steamship Authority or for Highline or whatever it might happen to be, so that it's still an accessible area, but this ramp and steel structure that would have to go into the ground would stop groundwater intrusion and also put us above flood elevations for 2070. I mean, high tide elevations for 2070, excuse me. So this is the inland open space. This is something that could be done to create a rain garden in the middle of it, somewhere for water to go, and then a hard stop where the red line is to stop water intruding further inland. And then something that might be done for, say, somewhere along Washington Street, I think, for the sake of argument, it might be a long linear structure that might be parallel to or in the road or to stop water. It could be a public seating facility, but once it gets to the 2070 mean monthly high water line, or about 7.3 feet above NAVD 88, which is just a little bit above mean low water, low tide, basically. That is the elevation we're talking about. We're not talking about 7 feet of elevation at the point on land. So there's other longer term options that were explored in the CRP, but did not make their way into the recommendations, the potential for an in-harbor system, but this wouldn't be something that would be necessary for a few decades until the 2050s or 2070s. It may never be needed, but something to start the conversation on now at this point, and that was the purpose of having it in the CRP. And as you can see, there's kind of 2 end lines here towards the southern end of this in-harbor structure. And maybe this isn't the structure that would finally end up, and it might look something more like this and come straight across towards Monomoy. Just a kind of a conversation starter to understand what might work. There's also a retreat scenario idea for the downtown area where you'd retreat from the area in orange. That also is just a conversation starter, but may not be what's acceptable to the public, just an idea at this phase. Moving around to other parts of the island and away from the downtown area, there's also ideas for defending areas like CO2 or barrier beach system that might take the form of beach nourishment or some system in the water to take energy out of the waves and stop erosion and cause accretion. The most critical areas in CO2 are across from Pocomo at Fourth Bend and at First Bend, where there's already low-lying areas, and there are some of the areas that might need some of the initial works on. Going across towards Mattakit, here's First and Second Bridge, the culverts that cross Long Pond at 2 locations. These are going to be areas that are going to suffer badly. Long Pond is tidal through Mattakit Ditch, and the water flow there through that Mattakit Ditch area is going to suffer badly from sea level rise and inundate the roads potentially. And the idea would be to raise the roads at these 2 locations and have either very much bigger culverts or a bridge system in order to allow water to move more freely and also allow plants and animals and habitat equality on either side of the road system. Similar idea at Folgers Marsh by the Life Saving Museum to raise the road there and have that yellow line represents what might be a new footpath or bicycle path or something to that effect, or wildlife viewing area. But again, this would have to be a raised road. And again, at Sacajah Pond, you may have to realign the road and raise it, but this is only an early schematic of what might need to be done based on the low-lying nature of the land between Sacajah Pond and the Sacajah Heathland on the other side that's owned by Mass Audubon. Once we start looking at the South Shore and how we might control erosion, we start getting into much larger projects and much more area specific projects. You start looking at how to do, when we did the work for the CRP, we found that there was much larger support for natural or near natural structures more than anything else. So you can see along the South Shore, we're going to follow a theme quite quickly, where you see dune building projects or dune nourishment projects, or just beach nourishment to widen beaches. And that's the part of what's being recommended here for the Matticat Bridge area to protect the end of Matticat Road, Ames Avenue and Ames Avenue Bridge. Ames Avenue Bridge would also have to have some significant works done to it if we were to continue to have that as a bridge. There's also an idea of having to retreat in this area, and this is an area that we might have to look at retreat in. And this shaded hatched area here represents where retreat might have to take place. And there's outlines of buildings you can see here in dotted lines in white that would be buildings that might have to move, sadly. But this is just a conversation starter at this point. Similarly, on the South Shore at the wastewater treatment plant or facility, and at the bottom of the airport, very similar ideas there for dune restoration and nourishment, or a near shore berm system at either. Moving on towards Tom Nevers Park, very similar idea there. And now that we have a new Parks and Recreation manager or director, I'm not 100% sure, Charlie can help us work through the issues here together with the Parks and Recreation Commission. In Sconset by Codfish Park, there's also a dune restoration site that might be needed. And this says tow protection and nourishment for the rest of the Baxter Road and Sconset Bluff area. That has its own separate project planning system as well. That is just worth noting. We can skip this one. I should have removed this slide. On the North Shore, there's two or three other things worth noting. In the Dionis to Cliffside area, they recommend some beach nourishment and strategic placement of sand. They also came up with this rather curious idea that didn't make it into a recommendation of a sand bypass system to take sand that would normally move in front of the harbour, that the jetty stopped from moving, to have a transport system, a basic set of pipes really, to move sand across either. That didn't become a recommendation. So that's the physical infrastructure. We now have to look at the other things the CRP recommended, one of which was a homeowner toolkit to recommend low cost, medium cost and higher cost solutions that might be acceptable to homeowners depending on their property and their ability to install some of these measures. I'm just going to move on in the interest of time. I know this is going on a little. We also have to bear in mind historic considerations, and we recently undertook Resilient Nantucket Designs for Adaptations, and we also have flood adaptation and building elevation guidelines. That was completed as part of an MVP project last summer. And historic preservation is also a key goal of the CRP. In order to get money for a lot of these projects, we're going to have to look at how the financing structure for this would work. Some money will have to come from the town, but we can also look to local, state and federal organizations that might be able to assist us to get financing through those channels. I've already started some of the basics for some state level and potentially some federal level funding systems, but they are long-term things that take time to come through. There's also a whole lot of policies that might have to change, everything from zoning to the wetland, to the town wetland ordinance for wetland protection, as well as how we might have to reevaluate some of the governance issues within the town. And some of those can be as simple as a weekly or monthly meeting with key staff to talk about and work out how these issues are advancing. So within the CRP, that's presented in big long white sheets like this. For most presentations, I just show the ID number and the title of the project, but for today and the committee that I'm speaking to today, I've also included the cost estimates and cost benefits as well. So I normally show that there's all these projects, there's about 20 on this page. I generally show 20 on the next page, but I've had to break that up. So some of the big ones that we're going to have to think about here, sediment transport studies and sediment budgets and maybe strategic retreat relocation programs and stuff like that. But let's, and then in the downtown area, the big ones like the downtown neighborhood flood barrier is 2.2, and then the phase 1 of that project is 2.6 at the bottom, and then the costs associated with those. Most of the island-wide ones have not much because they're either a policy change or that can be done by staff, but there are some here that do have costs associated with them, and it's very difficult to associate the benefits, what they might be. But once we start talking about the physical infrastructure and we start looking at the big projects like the downtown neighborhood flood barrier or the phase 1 section of it down here that could cost upwards of 12 to 13 million, but then the benefits are enormous, 120 million for that one. They're not all like that though, I have to stress that point. The downtown neighborhood flood barrier total could cost upwards of 170 million, but save 320 million. So that's the terms to think of it in. It's a massive cost, and we tried to get a lot of state and federal support for these projects, but the payoff and the cost savings are enormous. And these cost savings don't include some things that we found quite hard to quantify, such as the daily vehicle numbers and the pass through the areas. I see that Chris has his hand up. Would you like to ask a question now?
Oops. Yeah, just quickly, when you're talking about the benefits, what's the metric that's being used there? That's the fair market value of the real estate, or what is the economic?
Yeah, so for the most part, when we were trying to understand property costs, we used the tax assessor's value, not the fair market value for this.
And that's land and improvements. It's basically saying that wouldn't
Correct.
exist, be underwater and no longer a taxable property.
It also takes into account repetitive losses unless a house is moved, and it assumes that it may or may not. So it might remain in place and have many flooding events until it is irredeemable. I think that was one of the other metrics, is at what point it would become irredeemable. And I think they used a certain foot depth. I don't remember at the top of my head, but all of this is in the CRP, and I can send a link around afterwards, no problem. But in the interest of time, I'll just show you the rest of the projects around the island and I'll try and hit on some of the key points. So for the Madaket area, say for the raising of the bridges, you'd be looking at 36 to 40 million. And then there's an estimated benefit just in dollar terms of, but it doesn't take account goods and services that go backwards and forwards on that road. So that is likely a massive underestimate of the benefit cost. Other ones like the Madaket Erosion Pilot Project, they're expensive, but they could save 51 million over time and keep that as a viable community. Now, if there was community support for that where we had sizable community input, that then may become far more of a viable project. I've already, oh no, it's not on this one, it's on the next one. Is there anything else I should hit here? CO2 erosion management and dune restoration, that's something that I am looking at with the organizations that own most of CO2, namely NCF and Trustees Reservations. So that might not necessarily be an entire cost for the town or even close to it, and might be shared amongst those kind of organizations, just as an example. Just to look at the South Shore, the Surfside Wastewater Treatment Plant, the costs there are also quite high, but that's a new facility that is worth protecting. There is no benefit there other than to the fact that we wouldn't have to spend probably 3 times those costs in replacement. That's an estimate on my part. I'm guessing that I should probably stop at this point for more questions on the finance side of things.
Thank you, Vince. Questions for Vince? Peter Schaefer?
Yeah. Hi, Vince. Just a quick question. Where do you, or how do you assimilate the financing that a private individual's money or his insurance company's money would add to this project, any project?
That's very hard to do.
So everything you're showing us is based 100% on a governmental agency or Nantucket paying for?
No, not at all. So the guidance in this is they don't break it out how much might be gotten through grants. It assumes that most grants will be either 25% or 50%, and that large projects could only move ahead with grants for the sake of argument. It doesn't, so these are recommendations, they're not incumbent upon the town to take action on. So each recommendation may also alter over time. We got these to the kind of basic concept phase. Once we were to move ahead to the proper design phase and understand what would actually be entailed in construction, we might find that the 30% contingency that's built into all of these estimates might not be needed, and we might have overestimated it somewhat. But that is a good thing at this early planning stage, to overestimate and then find out that it's made potentially a lower cost later. It's also in 2021 dollars, bearing in mind that some of these projects may not be implemented for 10 to 15 years or longer.
Okay, so then can we assume that all private money and insurance company money would be an offset to whatever is on here?
I don't know that I can answer that question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Other questions? Vince, I had a couple questions. So particularly from an erosion standpoint, both the airport and the dump, are there risks, are there immediate risks that we should be concerned about?
So there's a project for the landfill resilience and the surrounding area for resilience from Long Pond to make sure that there's no infiltration and minimum impacts there. What was the other one? The sewer department?
It was the dump and the landfill, or
Yeah.
sorry, the dump and the airport.
Airport. So when we're looking at the airport, there's a lot of it's the town-owned land, and particularly the fence line for the sake of argument, but it's all controlled by the FAA. The FAA is developing its own sea level rise adaption methods for recommendations for airports. When we looked at the erosion zones there, we found that there was only one FAA light that was likely to be affected. The end of the runway may be affected in the very long term. But when we were chatting to the airport staff, they said that they also had space, for want of a better description, to the northeast of their site, if they had to lose a bit at the end of the runway, to just add that length on to the other end. So they have their fallback plan there. The fence line is a slightly different issue. It's required by FAA to have that as part of the airport, and that's already suffering issues. And as far as I know, there's already a plan at the airport to move sections of the fence line, and I think it's already in operation.
Thank you. Joe, you had your hand up, and then Chris, I'll go to you next.
Hi, Vince. Joe Grouse. I want to kind of go back to something that Peter was, I think, trying to get at, and I'm not sure. Well, I guess my question is, in these tens of millions of dollars of potential expense to repair roads and deal with ways to ameliorate the sea level rise, this is all spending on public assets, not the cost of the 2,600 or so. I think that was the one number I wrote down. 2,600 private homes that could possibly be damaged, destroyed, made unusable by sea level rise. So, am I sort of reading that back to you correctly? That it's all what your group has been dealing with is trying to deal with public assets and public funding of actions that could ameliorate this. It's not the cost of people moving their homes or abandoning their homes or whatever might happen. Is that correct?
Yes. So there's a substantial amount of that included in there. So for the vast majority, say for the downtown neighborhood flood barrier, that would have to be almost all on public property, except maybe one or two locations where it have to cross property lines to offer greater protection for some areas. There would be substantial public benefit to the properties that are on the landward side of that would gain protection. But for the sake of argument, most of it would be to raise the road to allow for access to the steamship, or just for goods and services to come and go without interruption. We already see quite a lot of interruption. I imagine people here didn't get to see the Coastal Resiliency Advisory Committee this Tuesday just gone. Chuck Larson presented some interesting information on the Easy Street Basin, and he looked at flood days from 1980 up until November 2021. And he broke it into decades. And in the 1980s, Easy Street was flooded about 5.6 days per year. And by the 2010s, the decade just passed, it was flooded 35 days per year. You know, the 35 days had flooding. He then tried to project it forward to the 2030s and 2040s. And when he tried to look at just the first amount of time we had for the 2020s now, he was up against 50 flood days already, but there's not enough data to match that yet. We're only a year and a bit into the decade. But by the time that he started to look at the projections forward to 2030 and 2040, we're going to be about 180 flood days per year, pretty much half the year, where high tide is going to get onto the road. So that already suggests that we're in massive trouble. So we need to raise the road. The businesses that we are around that would then have either some protection or something to that effect that would benefit them to some extent. But we also have to bear in mind that there might be some businesses, say properties that will be on the water side of these that might not get the same level of protection. We have to also consider that at this early stage. And what's the impact of that on those businesses and the shape of our town and our historic district? Because the historic district is a massive resource for us. And we can't just make it incumbent upon the property owner to preserve a historic building and then let everything else around it flood. So we have to have some level of responsibility to maintain the historic downtown district. And then once you start looking at other areas of the island, I don't know how that would work. For the most part, it's going to have to be on public property and public beaches. To protect the end of Madicate Road towards Ames Avenue. Once we start getting onto private properties, do we get agreement from those people, or do we just not do anything? That's the kind of stuff we have to work out now, and I think it's going to be the focus in the next year or so to try and understand these issues before we implement them.
Joe, anything
Thank
else?
you, Vince.
Okay.
Nope, I'm good. Thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, if you project forward to Saturday, you'll probably get a pretty good view of what Easy Street is going to look like in a couple of years. I'm curious, the land bank is increasingly making coastal resiliency part of kind of what it talks about, and obviously has become a really impressive owner of a lot of the coastal in-town real estate. And I don't know if this is a fair question, but are they, do you have a sense, are they working strategically with you, or are the moves they're making kind of informed by this overall strategy at this point, so that there's some level of coordination there?
We have good communication with the land bank, but they have their own mission and their own board to report to. I have good ties with them, and I try and stay up to date with what they're up to, and I keep them informed of what I'm up to. But they're their own independent. I think on their website it says quasi-governmental organization. They are somewhat standalone.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And so I have a question, which is, so when you're talking about, say something's going to cost, we spend $50 million on something public, and the accompanying, the properties that are on either side are private. So when you talk about the benefits, are you talking about the benefits of, as you said, the assessed value of those properties not being lost or destroyed? So because I'm guessing the benefits have to come from protecting, you know, by changing something public, a public thing, you then save a private thing. Is that how you calculated is that how not you personally, but is that how the benefits were calculated for the CRP?
It's a tricky one. So we were mainly looking at, say, the immediate public facilities, trying if it's a neighboring house or set of houses or neighborhood that might have a knock-on effect. Good for them, but that was not the original intent. Getting the road into a serviceable condition might be the goal. Other fringe benefits are that fringe benefits. The benefit to a property owner on one side might be unequal to the property owner on the other side of the road, And that's something that we're still struggling to understand, but it is not, the benefit is not necessarily to the property owner either side. The benefit is in the road.
Okay, thank you. Peter Schaefer?
So let's talk about Sconset Bluff, for example. There's 6 houses left on Sconset Bluff, or whatever the number is, and the value of them is today $5 million. Would the decision be made at maybe at some point to let it fall into the ocean because it's not, the cost benefit isn't there?
Well, Sconset is its own unique issue. There's a public
I'm just
road-
using that as an example. You can use any place on the island.
Yeah, well, there's a public road in place for the sake of argument.
Right.
And the town is obliged to provide that service in the road, as well as the services that are in the road, say sewer and water, that are facilities in that area. So if we wanted to retreat the road for the sake of argument, we'd have to go through a process, something that's already being investigated, quite honestly. I think it was approved at Select Board earlier this month, and we've started working on this. That is one example. Sheep Pond Road is another example, trying to work out how that would work in that area. The difference between Sheep Pond Road and Baxter Road is you move from one large neighbour at Sheep Pond Road in CF who have agreed or look like they might agree to a path forward in that area, versus at Baxter Road where you have a large number of property owners, and as things have broken up over time, 2 different ideologies on how to move forward, where there is a mismatch. So that is its own unique problem. And what I'm finding is no matter what part of the island you look at, I'm sure once we start dealing with issues in Dionis, that is going to be another unique issue. I don't think there is one solid answer anywhere.
But we're probably going to have one answer. Because you
I don't
can't
know
treat
that
one road different than the other. Yeah, that's, I don't know. Okay, neither here nor there. Go ahead. Thank you.
Well, Peter Schaefer, to your point, you'd probably have one policy or one decision tree for making decisions, but you'd have many different implementations of it.
Correct.
Right. So Peter McEachern?
Hi, good afternoon. Hi, Vince. Vince, we spoke a few months ago. You may not recall, but my question focuses on something we touched on.
We talked about Savage Pond, didn't we?
No, I think we met at Nantucket Yacht Club.
That's right.
My question is more whole on the Commonwealth. We're one community within the Commonwealth. There's many more communities that share the waterfront than we do. Has there been any active desire for our community to get involved with other communities? One would assume we're all going to be trying to vie for the same amount of money in the grants that come through the Commonwealth and the Fed. And that would be one question, because we all have to deal with the rules and regulations as they pertain to the waterfront licensing. And if you look at what the steamship remarked about the other night, and then you turn the clock back to what the steamship is doing and has been doing in Woods Hole, they started their feasibility study back then in 2013, and the regulatory constraints held them back at least 3 years, and then you can start a project, and that was Chapter 91 licensing. So I'm really interested in how we as Nantucket have embraced any other communities yet in the Commonwealth, and then I'd also love to know from a top of the bulkhead, so to speak, in the downtown, what other communities are literally closer to the water than us, because one would assume they would be flooding before we would. So it's a lot to digest, but can you maybe address how have we become proactive within the other or with the other communities?
To some extent, we are a leader.
Good.
Other communities might be looking to us in some of the examples that we're setting already. To be quite honest, when I was developing the early phases of this, I was looking at some of the existing coastal resilience plans that were out there. And for towns of our size, for the sake of argument, you had some nice plans. They weren't terrific. They were good. They worked for those communities. One of the ones that's out there is, at the moment that's still in development after many years is in Falmouth. Falmouth has a huge problem in a place called Surf Drive. And they're wrestling with those issues. We learned from what they did at Surf Drive. They came up with a wonderful, it was already used by Denise, I'm going to borrow it. It was a decision tree of sorts for when to abandon that road and when they might have to make certain decisions about what to do for that road. And it's all based on amounts of water hitting certain levels. So we're always looking at what our neighbors are doing. I'm always looking at what Martha's Vineyard is doing. We've been working closely with the Martha's Vineyard Commission. I've been trying to develop more ties with the Cape Cod Commission to try and build up some more understanding of what their issues they're facing for a lot of reasons, just so that I can understand what's going on in Hyannis, because if a boat can't leave there, it'll never get here. Simple things like that. So we're trying to understand a lot of those, but once we start looking at the quality of the coastal resilience plan that we've just now received, we're on par with Boston and New York. We're kind of ahead of that curve at the moment. And that was just by watching what other communities were doing and talking to other communities. I've had a number of emails over the last year, even from as far afield as Maine, asking me questions about how we developed it. And they're the Southeast Maine Shoreline Cooperative, I think they're called, contacted me because they wanted to develop a coastal resilience plan similar to ours. And I just outlined the scope and the methods and the community outreach that went into it. There was a second part to your question about the Steamship Authority in particular. That was an interesting one. And we had an interesting conversation with Bob Davis on Tuesday. And the process they went through with Woods Hole, as you rightly say, took a long time, and they had delays, not just COVID delays, but permitting delays. And now we should hope that the Steamship Authority has learned from that lesson and would hopefully shorten the timeline that they have discussed with us at Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee on Tuesday, which was 6 to 10 years, and might be able to shorten that a little, which would be nice. But it's all about lessons learned. And I didn't show it on screen now, but resilience is a cycle. You make your plans, you adapt, an area, you have to wait for a catastrophic event, then you learn from that again, and then you restart your resilience and planning cycle to know how to make things better. You don't just stop and become stagnant.
Yeah, so my thought process on trying to be an advocate for a program is to learn from what Steamship got involved with neighborhood groups or against them in Woods Hole on trying to raise their bulkheads, which would of course keep water at bay. So my other question or follow-up question would be, from a working with Boston and working with the Department of Environmental Protection, one would almost hope that they could make that process much more user-friendly for all public and private landowners to get things done that raise the level and put some distance between where the water may go to where the top of a bulkhead goes. So that's kind of I think maybe in the future we discuss that very briefly, but that's where I think that communities can get together. And it's great to hear that we're out in front, but it'd be great to think that if Boston is visited by hypothetically 70 communities that share a waterfront in Massachusetts, that we can maybe lessen the time of getting permits and getting those permits approved so we can take action. Because the plan looks great, but if we can't do anything because of red tape, forget about the money. It's a tough start.
It's a sentiment echoed by a lot of people, but we have to work with the system we have, and we can only do what we can. I need to do permits and get permits by the book. If there's a way to shorten those, that's fine. But one of the reasons for a long permitting system is to get it right. Measure twice before you cut once kind of approach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Joanna? And then after, if I'm going to actually say, unless anybody else has a really urgent question, we'll let Vince go, because as you can see, this is a topic everybody's very excited about, and it's very helpful to have you here, but we're kind of going, kind of going past our planned time with Vince. So Joanna, go ahead.
Vince, just a question for you around the permitting for the dredging of the sand in the ocean. Has there been any progress or any new news about how that is going to happen or be able to be rolled out?
You mean outside the harbors?
Yes.
Okay, there's kind of two ways to do dredging outside of the harbors in the open ocean for the sake of argument. Within state waters, within 3 miles, there's one permitting process. Effectively, that is very difficult and to near impossible. If you go out beyond that 3-mile area, there's also mapped areas out in the federal waters that are potentially more useful. The timeframes for mapping, for dredging in those areas, it could take even a year or two before they even open your permit to begin reviewing it. They're lengthy. Now, as I understand it, there might be other shorter ways if you have some dire need, but it is a lengthy process, no doubt about it. I've heard 7 years is about normal.
Okay. And then just a thought, Vince, just for this group, maybe if we could pull out the list of the 17 priorities and the associated costs, and everybody on this committee could get a copy of that, I think that would be super helpful.
Sure. Just to say that all these costs in here, the cumulative cost, everything has a low end and a high end cost. And if we were to add everything up that's in the CRP, I think it comes out as 840 in the low end to 930 million at the high end. But I also like to qualify that is a heck of a lot of money. I would anticipate to get an awful lot of that in terms of grants. But even that, just take at the top end of it, the 930 million, that is against the 3.4 billion in losses. So that's about a 2.5 times savings to potential costs. And if we want to save our island, save our community from sea level rise, might be cheap.
Thank you, Vince.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Joanna. Mary, I'm going to go ahead and call on you, but I'm going to also let Vince go. So because unless you need him to stay.
I want to offer a thank you. First of all, it's been wonderful working with Vince. Mary Longacre, I'm the chair of the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee, and he did an excellent job with this presentation today. I hope that you appreciated that. I wanted to add a little bit of context around the presentation. The first is to go back to the maps and the all of the values for sea level rise. Those are simply for a high tide. They do not include storms. And that's one of the reasons why the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee recommended using the high scenario for planning. It gives a little bit of a buffer between the regular tidal rise and what we might experience in a storm. And as I'm sure you're all familiar, the storms are events of huge magnitude. They don't last very long, but when they destroy things, they don't just bounce back the way that flooding from a tide goes back out to sea. So keep that in mind as you're considering this, that the CRP deals only with sea level rise to a regular tide, a high tide, doesn't include the effects of storms. And that's going to be true of most of the data that you see coming from the federal or the state government as well, unless it specifically mentions that it takes storms into account. So that is just a little bit more sense of urgency there on these projects. I also want to say it is possible that we won't be able to do all of these projects, and we will have to stop and think about what will it look like if we don't. Many of these projects are first steps. There will be additional steps beyond them as conditions get worse. So it's definitely worth considering the cost of not doing anything, also considering not doing anything as a viable option when you look at all of the dollars involved. But there's definitely the hope that those dollars will come from many sources. As Peter McEachran rightly mentioned, we will be in competition with other communities for those dollars. And it's really hard to imagine what it's going to look like in 25 years for the world, not just our little island. We also were in touch with someone in Hawaii, for instance. They have a lot more elevation to work with and a lot larger islands, but being islands, there's some similarities, and we're trying to learn from best practices where we can find them. Hawaii is also a leader, I think, in the coastal resilience space. And the last thing I want to mention is the community engagement and involvement. Again, Peter McEachran mentioned that there was some opposition in Woods Hole to some of the work at the Steamship Authority. The more the community is involved, the more the community supports these projects, the easier it is to get them done. In particular, I want to point out that the events that the Coastal Resilience Advisory Committee held for the CRP were attended by well over 100 people for the public open houses. And that level of attendance far surpassed the level of attendance, for instance, in New York for their coastal resilience plan. We did get tremendous public engagement, and we really appreciate the public that offered comments, that engaged with the process, that had a lot to go into the development of the coastal resilience plan. But that can't stop. That has to continue, because when it comes to funding these, we're definitely going to need public support and public education. In addition to the education, as some have mentioned, that private homeowners will have responsibilities for protecting their own properties. So we are producing educational materials for them. The state has a great brochure out. So there's definitely a whole nother aspect to this. The coastal resilience plan does focus primarily on the public infrastructure, but the private homeowners will need to learn what they can do with their properties as well. So thank you again. And if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Mary. And seeing no hands raised, I will thank both Mary and Vince. Mary, thank you for your leadership on this important topic. And Joanna for participating actively on it as our crack member. And Vince, it was very helpful to have you here. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Okay, thank you, everyone. All right, we'll move on now to the discussion of Article AA. Well, I'm sure it's renumbered at this point. Erica just sent it out, but I didn't check. The Community Preservation Committee for Affordable Housing Trust. Ken, I'll actually start with you, and then I will move over to Tucker Holland. And Brian Sullivan, thank you for also being here today. So, Ken?
Thank you, Denise. When we last met, there were a number of questions that were raised with respect to some greater detail with respect to the level of the understanding of how the
Oh,
money's
Ken, sorry. I have to have, Joe, you have to recuse at this point and just become a private citizen.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering whether I do it now or when we have our discussion, but yeah, I have to recuse myself.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Okay, sorry, Ken, go ahead.
That's okay. So what we were talking about is that you were looking for a little bit greater detail with respect to how the original $5 million bond was utilized in terms of the affordable housing issues and the issue of heads and beds. And then also you wanted some thought process that is going into what the proposed use of the second $5 million bond would be intended to be used for relative to the build out of the housing, as opposed to the first portion was more involved in acquisition of properties. The second is more involved in the build out and the construction of the properties, although there might be some amount of the money utilized for purchase of a piece of land if the opportunity presents itself. And so working with Tucker and Sully, they have prepared a chart which we would like to go over with you in terms of showing you how the original $5 million was utilized, some update in terms of what's happening with respect to your question, Denise, as to heads and beds, and following further information than what I was able to provide last time. And then also some information with respect to the projected uses of how the second $5 million bond would be used for affordable housing. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tucker and then have him do the presentation and then be available for questions from anyone on the committee relative to the CPC procedure. I think that it's really important to note that in the proposed allocation for the funding for this year, the CPC voted to, in fact, provide an allocation for the first principal and interest payment on this bond on the assumption that it is in fact going to be funded and awarded, so there is no concern with respect to the taxpayers other than what they contribute through the CPC surcharge, having to have any payment with respect to the award of this particular funding.
Thank you, Ken. Tucker?
Thanks very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Should I screen share here, Denise?
That would be great, Tucker. I mean, I did send out what you sent me to the Finance Committee, but I think it's easier when we're talking about it for everyone to be able to see it at the same time.
Great. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here and shed some light on where the original $5 million bonding was spent or is intended to be spent. And then we'll get into the plans for the request and recommendation from the CPC that is on this year's warrant. So as Ken mentioned, a good portion of the original bonding was geared toward acquiring the land that will be required to develop the properties that will both serve our year-round residents and contribute toward the town meeting its 10% requirement under the state 40B mandate. So here you can see, I will say up front here, the CPC funding was critical in our ability to be able to operate efficiently in the real estate market and take advantage of these opportunities that were presented to us. I mean, I think in hindsight, particularly with what's happened in Nantucket real estate over the course of the last couple of years, we were very fortunate to be able to act at the time that we did. So the board is probably familiar that we acquired 2 adjacent parcels on Orange Street at 135, 137 Orange. A portion of the funding went toward that acquisition. Similarly, $650,000 went toward a program that we are doing out at Richmond that we refer to as the Wildflower Acceleration. This involved both a buy down of affordability within that project. 12 units have deeper affordability restrictions as a result of that buy down, and the structure there is that the total program is a $2.6 million program with $900,000 going toward the buy down, and the balance actually is a loan over the long term. And the buy down resulted in 6 units being restricted at 100% AMI and 6 units being restricted at 50% AMI, which are 2 levels that are not otherwise served within the Richmond project. Carrying on, a portion of these funds are allocated toward our planned acquisition of 12 and 12R Bartlett Road, which we expect to close on in the course of the next month or so. We also allocated a portion of these funds, and I apologize to the committee. I think that this had a slightly incorrect label on what was circulated. This is a Habitat for Humanity project, but these funds were dedicated to the 2 units that were created within Richmond at the Beachgrass Drive location, so not the Benjamin Drive location. So I just wanted to clarify that. And that those funds both went for the land acquisition as well as the construction of the units. And what that allowed Habitat to do was basically tee itself up for all future Habitat homes to be eligible on the SHI list. So further portion of these 5 million funds were used for the acquisition at the UMass property on Vesper Lane. And then finally, a portion went toward the land acquisition at 31 Fairgrounds Road. So, you know, we've got a couple of photos included here, just showing some of the activity that is underway. There was a groundbreaking actually last week at the 31 Fairgrounds site. Actually was, you know, just a terrific event. And the boxes, if you will, have been ordered for the 8 buildings that will comprise this project of 22 units, and anticipated occupancy is fall of this year. And if one were to drive out Old South Road today, they would actually see that the boxes have been set for the first of the 3 buildings that are part of the Richmond Wildflower Acceleration. I will add with regard to that project, just recently we received from DHCD confirmation that that project, as planned, has now extended our safe harbor period until December of this year. So with regard to, I guess I'll stop. Are there questions on where the monies have been spent, or should I go on to how we're planning for the next 5?
I don't see any hands, so go ahead, Tucker.
Thank you. So for the second 5 million, as Ken already mentioned, really the bulk of this is geared toward the construction and build out at many of the sites that we were just discussing on the prior page. So there are 2 allocations, as you can see, that are geared toward planned projects of both Housing Nantucket and Habitat for Humanity. In addition, there is a small allocation, as Ken mentioned, to the potential of an additional home ownership site, much like the White Street property that we were offered and purchased at a bargain sale price. I think the board is probably familiar that home ownership opportunity has been added as a strategic plan priority for the select board. And so we are working to address that need as well. And then really, 50% of the funds are geared toward the construction, both at the Orange Street location and at the Vesper Lane site. And I'll add that we are working closely with the hospital with regard to the Vesper Lane location.
Thank you, Tucker. Questions from the committee? Nice. Peter McEachern?
Just a comment, Tucker, phenomenal job. It's been great to see where everything housing has been going the last couple of years. It's also good to see that money is going out and being put to the uses that you collectively have been, that you unveiled. So thank you very much.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Peter.
And Joe, before I close, if there's no more questions, Joe, do you want to make a comment as a member of the public before I close the public comment so we can discuss a motion?
Sure. If I could just add, I think you all know that I've been on the board of Habitat for Humanity in Nantucket for about 10 years. And I guess I just wanted to let everybody know that certainly over the last 3 years, as you can see from the 2 slides that Tucker displayed, Habitat has had about, I guess if you add them together, $1.7 million of support from the CPC, which has been historically been the source of a lot of our construction capital. And that's enabled Habitat to basically build a 2-unit duplex on Beachgrass in the Richmond property that was completed this past summer, has 2 families moved in November. And the Benjamin Drive project that was mentioned is a 3-unit single family house, a 3-unit development, a single family and a 2-unit duplex that will house 3 families. We're just finishing up the family selection process for that. And just to give you a scope of the issue on affordable housing on Nantucket, if we don't already know this well enough anyway, we received 66 applications for 3 houses for the Benjamin Drive program. And just some of the work that I've done over the last 4 months in reviewing these applications, we have a big problem, and it's certainly important that the CPC and the town via the Affordable Housing Trust continues to fund affordable housing in a variety of strategies, because there are an awful lot of people out there that need decent places to live. Anyway, thanks for your time, Denise, and I appreciate everybody listening.
Thank you, Joe. Sally? You're on mute, Sally. You're on mute. Can't hear you now. Nope. Computer 1, Sully 0. Okay, then. I was just going to ask you if you wanted to add anything to the comment, Tucker.
Well, Habitat's been doing fantastic work. I just also was going to add, I think it's important in the conversation that's going on up at the State House around the transfer fee, which we obviously very much would like to have happen this session. And there's a big push for that. It is very useful to be able to talk about the very strong commitment of CPC dollars toward housing in the conversation about the transfer fee at the State House. I think one of the things that people ask, legislators ask about is, are you using all the tools you have available before you ask for another tool? And Nantucket, maybe more than any other community, is able to say yes. And with what's happened with the CPC is a big part of that ability.
Thank you, Tucker. Okay, not seeing any other hands. I'm going to close the public comment section of this and then ask for if a member of the Finance Committee has a motion in respect of this article.
Move to adopt.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Second,
Thank you. Any discussion relative to the motion? In which case by roll call, George,
Aye.
Peter McEachern,
Aye.
Peter Schaefer,
aye,
Chris,
Aye.
Stephen? Stephen's frozen or on mute. Yeah, I can see his lips go aye. Joanna?
Aye.
Denise, aye. That passes unanimously. Okay, thank you.
Denise, on behalf of the committee and on behalf of the community, I want to say thank you for the hard work that you and your committee do. An unenviable task, but we really appreciate your effort, and the questions that you put to us are really important because, in fact, as Tucker has said, it's really important for everybody to understand how big of an issue this is and how we have to be able to put all of our resources as a community forward to making this, helping us solve this problem. So thank you to you and to your entire committee.
Oh, you're most welcome, Ken. Thank you very much. And also, we very much appreciate you and Tucker and Brian when he can actually speak, Sullivan. Or maybe when he doesn't have to speak, that's also okay too. So we very much appreciate everything that you do in respect of this and are happy to be collaborating and working through this together with all of you. So good. Okay.
Perfect, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. All right, next agenda item is committee reports. Does anybody have a committee report that they want to report on? Joanna, please.
So the contract review committee has finished with all of our individual meetings of the different agencies. They've come before us. We've probably spent 40+ hours interviewing them over the course of the last month. This coming week is our site visits to the different locations. And then after that, we will deliberate. I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview with regard to that. There is $650,000 of town money, and we have $875,000 in requests. In terms of the cannabis money, they're anticipating $100,000, and there's $300,000 in requests. One of our most discussed grants is on the list, and that is the ambulance transport for different types of mental health issues from the hospital off island. And the thing that's interesting about that I wanted to share with the committee is that I distinctly remember the first year that we discussed this request, the need was maybe $115,000, and it was 8 to 12 people. Last year, they took 56 people. So that is a significant increase in terms of some mental health issues facing our island. And they're asking for a big chunk of that $650,000. So for now, that's what I'd like to share with everyone. And I will report back when we finish our deliberations.
Thank you, Joanna. And as always, we'll have Dorothy come to the committee as and when the report is ready and you have all finished what you've done. And we will then discuss that article at that time. And thank you for contributing to that. Having Stephen and I can definitely reflect on how much work it takes. So it's important work and it takes quite a bit. So thank you. Okay. I don't think we have any other committee reports today. Date of our next meeting, as you know, is Saturday, 8 o'clock, bright and early. Everybody has their budget assignments. I have to say to Brian that I think the storyboard links are so helpful compared to having paper, and to be able to dive onto each little bar and see things and do a little analysis myself. It's really, I have to say, we're much further along in terms of understanding the budgets because of the content and the quality of the content we now have access to. So thank you. I'll repeat that again on Saturday, of course, but as I've been reviewing the stuff this week, I have to say it's really, really helpful.
Madam Chair, I actually have to thank Maria because she has put in yeoman's effort to put them all together and get it done. So it's a lot of the thank you goes to her, the attention to detail and her work with the departments and putting it together.
Thank you. Okay, great. And then I'm keeping my fingers crossed that Saturday everybody has power, if you believe the doomsayers on the weather. I like my weather app. It's telling me 1 inch of snow and a little bit of wind. So I'm going to go with my weather for Saturday because it seems like the better weather compared to what everybody else is getting. And so as and when we have a problem on Saturday, we'll figure it out. We've got quite a few meetings still scheduled. If we have to push them out, we will. So, okay. And then with that, I have no other business. Does anyone else have any other business? In which case, may I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Roll call, George,
Aye.
Chris,
Aye.
Peter McCashern,
Aye.
Peter Schaefer,
Aye.
Stephen,
Aye.
Joanna,
Aye.
Joe,
Aye.
Denise, I, and Vince, thanks again for being here. It was very helpful. Brian,
Pleasure.
Maria, Libby, helpful as always, as you know. All right, see you guys, for most of
Thank you.
you. See you Saturday.
See you
See you
Saturday.
Saturday.
Aye.
Thanks, everyone.